Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
An investigative series into sexual abuse of rural Alaskans by Jesuit priests found a disturbing history of deception and cover-up spanning decades. We'll discuss it tonight on Alaska Insight. Good evening. For almost 2 decades, the Catholic Church has been reckoning with the history of sexual assault by dozens of Jesuit priests in the United States. In Alaska, the majority of that abuse was perpetrated in rural villages. Tonight, we'll discuss a series of reports from the broadcast program Reveal and the Center for Investigative Reporting. The stories examine allegations against Father James Poole, who was once a priest and well-known local DJ in Nome, and what happened to Poole after he left Alaska. Reveal originally shared the following video on their social media site, a warning to our viewers that tonight's discussion and the video we're about to see may be disturbing for some and not appropriate for young viewers.
Father Poole, you destroyed lives and you hurt countless women and girls. Has anybody ever said that to you?
Yeah. I thought I was bringing love into the life of other persons.
By engaging in sexual acts with them?
By being intimate.
And what's your definition of intimacy?
Everything short of intercourse.
When songs were playing, you know, he would kiss me, and it was kind of weird.
How old were you?
I don't know, 11, 12.
My guests this evening are Emily Schwing. Emily is a reporter with Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Lori.
Also in the studio tonight is Buhen, also known in English as Elsie Boudreau. Hi, Elsie.
Hi, Lori.
Elsie is a sexual assault survivor and an advocate for other victims. Elsie, I first want to say I'm sorry that you had to see this video. I'm sure that it's upsetting for you to see and hear Father Poole, and I'm sorry that we have to start the program off that way.
Well, thank you for that. As I'm sitting here and I watched it, I was there in the room when he gave his deposition. So I remember being there. I remember his words. I remember when I first walked into the room, the first thing I smelled was his breath, and I turned around and walked out because it was too overwhelming. He had a distinct smell.
Well, thank you for being here and for your courage in coming forward as you have. I know that it's helpful for others who have not taken that step yet, so thank you for your bravery in that regard.
Thank you.
This massive amount of paperwork that you have in front of you represents the case against the church and Father Poole, is that correct?
Yes.
What is it like to have that kind of physical manifestation of all that you had to endure through those years?
Well, it's it can be empowering in a way, because what it does is it validates the fact that these things happened to me and someone believed me. And it's in black and white. It shares my story. It shares the impact that it had on me and my family. And so
you can keep it contained in that book.
Yes.
Emily, start off with how you first got onto this particular investigation. When did you first start digging into the church, the allegations against the church?
Well, I had lived in Alaska for quite a while. I'd been a reporter. I was in graduate school up in Fairbanks when a lot of these cases were starting to become public knowledge. So I'd always kind of known about this story more broadly. And then in 2016, I went out and worked in Nome for a few months at KNOM. And so I kind of knew that there was something that had happened there, in that radio station's history, but no one ever really characterized what exactly went down. And it wasn't until a year later, after I had moved to Spokane, Washington, where I found out that James Poole was living at a retirement home on Gonzaga University's campus. And I knew his name. I recognized it because I had worked at KNOM and he had founded that radio station. And then that's when I started looking into where he was living, why he was living on a university campus, and who else was, living alongside him. And that's how I came to find out more about the story.
And I want to talk more about his later years, but back up to his time in Alaska and what you were able to find in your investigation about his time in Nome and in other communities.
Mm-hmm. So James Poole started his career as a Jesuit priest in St. Mary's, where Elsie was born and raised, way back in like 1948. And that was the same time I found the first letter with allegations from another priest who was concerned about his behavior with young girls in that village. He was subsequently taken out of the village. He left for a year, but then he was sent right back into another Alaska Native community. And then that was sort of how his career went for the next 40 years or so, where, he'd be in a place for a couple years and then he'd get moved. And eventually he did go to Nome and he was there for quite some time. And then stories about what Father Poole was doing to volunteers at the radio station and also nurses in Nome started to surface. And that's when he was moved to Tacoma, Washington to be a hospital chaplain. And eventually, a lot of the stories caught up with him at the same time that he was getting much older, and so he was retired to this home in Spokane, Washington.
Elsie, how important was the church in your community when you were growing up in St. Mary's? What did it mean?
Well, I was Catholic, and in a lot of ways I always say then I was more Catholic than I was Yupik. And today I'm a strong Yupik woman, and I'm proud to say that, and I wear my gaspak proudly. But back then it was like the church was everything. The church was the center of and the heart of the community. It was huge. It was a big part of the community.
Did you first meet Father Poole in St. Mary, or where? Tell us how your interaction with him came to be.
Okay, so I'm wanting to share with you this picture of me when I was just a baby, and I don't know if you can see that, but we were.
Let's hold that up and let
just
the camera see it. There you are in a wash tub.
In a wash tub, and I'm protected and safe and well cared for. And so what I want to say is Father Poole was like a family friend. He knew my family long before I was born, and he was good friends with my sister, and she knew him from the time she was like 6 years old or so, and she's 17 years older than I am. And she actually moved to Nome and volunteered at KNOM, and that's where she met her husband. And so I would go and spend the summers in Nome, and we spent a lot of time with the KNOM volunteers. We would go and have dinner with them. Father Poole would come and have breakfast at my sister's house, and I remember times when he would hold me on his lap and he would tickle me, and he was a priest, yes, but he was also a family friend. And through this I've learned, like, my sister and her husband, who are very dear to me, regarded him as like their father, and so this touches on not just a priest in the church, but someone that we loved. And he married them. He came to St. Mary's they got married when I was 9. And we've known him for a long time.
When you first talked to your family and then others about what had happened to you, about the abuse that had happened to you, how was that received, given what you've just said about how integral a part of the family he really was?
Well, I just want to preface that because my family and we've done a lot of work around this, and there's been a lot of tears shed and a lot of feelings shared, and there's been a lot of hurt, and just like in any situation when people operate out of denial as a way to protect themselves from the truth, that happened in my family. And that played out, and I say that lovingly, knowing that my sister and I have come to a place now where there's been forgiveness, and I know many families that when, even for young children now who have been abused and their parents don't believe them or operate out of denial, in some ways that can, cause a lot of harm, almost more so than the abuse itself. And so I feel like I just did a double-edged sword, like I said. Anyway.
Being believed is important.
Being believed is so important.
Yes.
And so I think that I understand where, my family came from, in that they loved Poole, and it was a hard thing to deal with, knowing that he could have done something like this to me and to many other girls.
Such a level of betrayal.
Yes.
Emily, in your investigative work, how many of abusive priests did you find in both Alaska and the Pacific Northwest? Because there is allegations that they were sort of put into Native communities, particularly in Alaska and in communities along the Pacific Northwest coast?
Yeah, so when I started to approach the story, I found out about this sort of theory of dumping grounds that Native American reservations and Alaska Native communities were used as dumping grounds for so-called problem priests. And so it was really important to me that we try to prove that theory and find a way to show that this either was or was not the case. And so what we were able to do was put a number to it. We gathered a lot of data from a couple different sources and found that there were Jesuit priests who had been accused of sexual abuse, assault, and or misconduct in more than 100 Native communities in both Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, in what was formerly known as the Oregon Province of the Jesuits. So that includes Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And then from there, we were also able to say that we found 92 priests who served in that region, and they, 80% of those 92 priests at some point in their career served in at least one Alaska Native village or on a reservation. The numbers of priests that we found in this region of the Northwest in Alaska was 3.6 times higher than numbers of credibly accused priests that we found anywhere else in the United States.
Some within the Jesuit order tried to raise a red flag about Father Poole, but had their own problems. Tell us about Segundo Lorente, who wrote to not only American church officials, but also to the Vatican.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Segundo Lorente was kind of a superior to James Poole, and so he would travel to villages to sort of check in on priests. And he wrote a letter to the head of the Jesuit order in Rome, who's sort of, the slang term for his title is the Black Pope. So he's in charge of all of the Jesuits across the globe. And this was back in the late 1940s. And his letter outlined concerns he had about how James Poole was conducting himself at an all-girls school in St. Mary's. So he would go in, James Poole would go in and like rearrange the girls' beds. And he would have them into his room, and he would really press them hard in confession about whether or not they were having impure thoughts. And and some of these girls were teenagers, so they were at that, age in puberty where you might have some thoughts you don't know how to deal with. But he would keep them for hours. And so Segundo Lorente characterized all of these actions in a letter to Rome. And what I found out later is that Segundo Lorente also has credible accusations of abuse to his name. He's not the only priest who wrote a letter about James Poole. There were other priests who also raised flags in correspondence about Father Poole over the years. And it turns out those priests as well had credible allegations against them.
Elsie, in the work that you do now with other sexual assault survivors, how far-reaching do you think this is in Alaska, sort of the ripple effect of generations of this abuse? And you have said that you feel like the church was trying to eradicate Native identity. How is that all rolled together, and how do you explain that to us, please?
So I think it is very widespread, and if you think about it, there are villages that have generations of people that have been sexually abused by clergy. And we know for a fact that in some villages there were perpetrator priests that were in the same village over 3 decades. And so in my work, after I filed my lawsuit, I worked with the attorneys that represented me. I talked to over 300 survivors in Alaska. And what we know is that like only 1 in 10 or so ever really come forward. So we know that there's a whole lot of other people that have been sexually abused by clergy that have never spoken their truth. The oldest person I worked with was, I believe at the time, she was 76. And she had gone to the Holy Cross Mission. And so I'm still in touch with her today. She's a beautiful lady, and has had to come to terms with the fact that not only was she in the orphanage at the time, but that she was used to satisfy this, and he was a superior at the time, his needs. And so I think about, you know, like the widespread problem of this. It affects people's spirit. It affects their mental ability to connect. It affects people's ability to connect and be in a relationship with other people. It affects how people view themselves and hold and are with themselves in their own body. So there's an element of shame, and shame is different than guilt, you know, and when people operate out of that shame is there's something wrong with me. And so, so it affects so many people, and shame is crippling, and it's almost like it's holding people hostage in their own body, in a way.
And the
In their own
eradication of your thoughts about sort of a systematic attempt to eradicate Native culture and identity.
Yes. I know that colonization is something that we as Native people are coming to grips with. You know, we have a name for it, historical trauma. And that there were the missionaries played a role in going out to communities to, quote unquote, save the man. What is that term? Kill the man.
Kill the Indian,
Kill
save
the
the
Indian,
man.
save the man. That's it. Yeah. So, you know, they played a role in that, and you know, looking at people, Native people, as less than human, and so it's part of like a larger systemic piece where, you know, that's connected to the government, you know. So, I mean, yeah.
It's wide-ranging.
It is.
It was.
It is, yeah.
Emily, what happened to James Poole when he went to tell us about Gonzaga University and the Cardinal Bea House there?
Yeah, so the Cardinal Bea House is sort of this nondescript brick building. It's not a house, it's like an office building from like the 70s or 80s. And it was used as a retirement home. It's still being used as a retirement home for Jesuit priests. It's owned and operated by the Jesuit order, but it is on campus. There's a lot of people at Gonzaga who argue that it's not on campus, but students walk by it all the time. The new Performing Arts Center for Gonzaga University is in its backyard. You know, students have in the past gone there for spiritual guidance. So it does have a connection to the university. This was a place where the Oregon province of the Jesuits would retire older priests who no longer could or wanted to say Mass and offer other sacraments. And so James Poole wound up there. He also wound up there with at least 20 other credibly accused Jesuits who had lived there since as far back as 1986.
Elsie, we only have a minute or so left. Do you think the church is doing enough now to address past abuse and to ensure that there is prevention and that this won't happen in the future?
Well, I think that a lot of work still needs to be done. And there are still way, way, way too many people out there that are hurting in silence. And the church has a responsibility to reach out to people and to assure them that they've done nothing wrong. And, you know, the church talks about being transparent. I don't know, you know, I sit here today and I don't know if there are young girls being abused in the church today. I don't know that. So I don't believe enough is being done, and, you know, I hold my breath.
All right, thank you. We'll have to leave it there. We may never know the full magnitude of harm perpetrated against hundreds of vulnerable children and young adults by predatory priests, because some victims will not want to discuss what happened to them. That is their right. But to shine light into the dark sadness and fear of these crimes is a painful necessity to acknowledge past wrongs, bring justice, and build awareness to prevent future assaults from occurring. The diocese in Alaska have stated commitments to accountability, transparency, and responsibility, with a focus on healing for victims and prevention, so that no one else ever has to carry the trauma of assault and terrible secrets again into their future. You can watch past episodes of Alaska Insight on our website, alaskapublic.org/Alaska Insight. We'll be back next Friday, right after Washington Week. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night.